Hello, scholars! This is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we covered the scientific method and its steps. In this video, we're going to look at different sociological methodologies, as well as their positive and negative aspects. So let's get started. Sociologists have a very interesting occupation in that they get to study the world's people, watching for interesting patterns and then essentially studying them. When a sociologist decides to study the behaviors of a group, they need to choose a research method in order to conduct that study. A research method is a detail-oriented and organized manner of using the scientific method to study a certain phenomena. This methodology will help to gather information about the group of individuals that are being observed. Deciding which research method to use for a study is a difficult decision for most sociologists. One of the first questions a sociologist wants to ask themselves is whether or not it would be beneficial to be seen by those being observed or not. Will the results of the study be more applicable if the researcher becomes somewhat invisible or if they take a more active and visible role within the study? The Hawthorne Effect is when participants in a study change the manner in which they behave because they know they're being observed or studied. Sometimes it's almost impossible to not have this happen. As discussed in the last video, the American Sociological Association may dictate that participants have to be informed when they're part of a study. This is especially important if there are vulnerable populations included. Examples of vulnerable populations include those below the age of 18, certain individuals with disabilities, certain racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and prison populations. Whether or not groups of individuals are considered vulnerable populations depends upon the field of study and the current regulations of the appropriate professional association. For information about vulnerable populations in the field of sociology, please visit the American Sociological Association online. There are 4 research designs that tend to be used most often by sociologists. These methodologies include field research, surveying, experimentation, and secondary data analysis. Each of these research methodologies has advantages and disadvantages. The first research design we're going to talk about is field research. Oftentimes, when sociologists study various groups of people, they get the best information from being in the same environment as the participants live and work in. Groups of people tend to show more common behaviors when they are in environments that are familiar to them. When a sociologist goes to the places that participants live, work, and interact, they tend to gain information that's more indicative of everyday reality. When a sociologist goes into a new environment for field research, it becomes their job to observe the people without bias, and sometimes they will participate within the community. It is more important to note that fieldwork does not mean sociologists will get information that provides causes and effects for group behavior. Sociologists observe different group phenomena and try to find a correlation between group behaviors and influences on others. They try to establish a relationship between the two variables. There are 2 types of field research that are used by most sociologists. The first type is called participant observation. This is when the researcher will take part in the activities and become as much a part of the group as possible. This allows the sociologist to experience certain aspects of the group and its interactions. The researcher is allowed to be directly in an institution, look for patterns, and note certain behaviors. Sociologists do not attempt to stand out in a group, but are supposed to observe and record information as best as they can. There are times when the researcher will not allow others to know their true identity or that they are doing a study. They do this because they don't want others to change their behaviors because they know what the purpose of the study is. The sociologist will observe and watch for patterns. They may ask questions which will help to learn more about the behaviors of the group. These observations may lead to a hypothesis or a reshaping of the hypothesis. One of the most interesting participant observations that I read was written by Barbara Ehrenreich in the book Nickel and Dimed. It was quite a few years ago that I read this, but Ehrenreich attempted to live off of minimum wage in a couple different jobs like being a maid and working at a department store. The book is witty and isn't always consistent without having bias, but her revelations concerning living on minimum wage were very interesting. A second type of field research is known as ethnography. An ethnography tends to take a long period of time and usually observes the social cultures of a social setting. Ethnographies are supposed to provide an objective look at a society of people. They can be more in-depth and address how different people see themselves in relation to their communities. The observations made by the ethnographer need to be objective in order to better understand the social norms of that group. The survey method is the next research design that a sociologist might choose for their study. The survey method tends to be the research method that is used most by sociologists. This method tends to be less expensive and can cover more people at a time than most other research designs. The survey method often utilizes a questionnaire with a certain amount of questions seeking the opinions or perceived behaviors of the participants. The survey method is supposed to be confidential and that subjects will feel more likely to express their true beliefs about a subject if their identity is not being provided. There is a big difference between surveys that are constructed by sociologists versus those that are constructed via marketing companies. Those surveys that are constructed by sociologists have to take into consideration the wording of questions, how a person's culture might impact how questions are answered, and whether or not people feel they can be honest with their answers. When surveys are constructed and handed out, they generally focus on a specific group of people. If a researcher wants to look at a larger population, they will tend to take a small sample, a smaller group of individuals that represents the demographics of a larger population. In a random sample, every person within the group should have the same chance of being picked for the study. Random samples are supposed to be indicative of the population as a whole. If they are not considered representative. Sociologists that use the survey method will describe the purpose of the study before they hand it out to people. Participants must be asked if they would like to participate and thanked for their time in doing so. The results of the study need to be made available to participants as they will want to know how others answered in comparison to themselves. When the survey method is used, generally sociologists will choose a questionnaire for their study. The participant will answer a set of questions, which can be quantitative, meaning close-ended, asking for a yes or no answer or using a Likert scale, or can be qualitative, open-ended, and possibly short answer. Again, establishing that questionnaires will remain confidential will increase the chances of honest answers by participants. Another form of survey is the interview, which is a one-on-one conversation between the subject and the researcher. This can be in person or over the phone. The subjects are supposed to be able to respond as they wish without any defined choices. Advantages of interviews are that the researcher can ask questions if they do not understand the answers by participants, or they can probe the subject further to learn more about the topic. If the researcher wants to add questions at a moment's notice, they can do that. Some disadvantages of the interview are, if the sociologist seems untrustworthy, they may not get the honest answers to their questions that they are seeking. The third research design used by sociologists is the experiment. During an experiment, a researcher is attempting to find a correlation between two or more variables. Experiments can be conducted in a lab or in the natural environment of the participants. In the lab experiments, the setting can be controlled in a way that the natural environment cannot. The time that it takes to conduct an experiment in a lab can also be better controlled than in the natural setting. When a researcher uses an experiment, they'll often divide a group of people into an experimental group versus a control group. The experimental group will receive some sort of change within the experiment. This change is known as the independent variable. The control group will not get the independent variable. The effect of introducing the independent variable will lead to the dependent variable, which is the effect that the independent variable has on the group. The fourth sociological research method is known as the secondary data analysis. This is when sociologists will look through the studies conducted by other sociologists, economists, teachers, or historians and gather information looking for patterns either within the study or in the data collection. This data by multiple studies often leads to new information that can draw correlations about different aspects of society. Let's say a sociologist wants to study crime in cities that have a population of over 1 million people. Maybe they also look at periods of time that the economy was doing well compared to when the economy was doing poorly. If the sociologist found a relationship between upward or downward trends in crime depending upon how the economy is doing, they found a correlation or relationship between the two variables. One advantage of the secondary analysis is that no subjects are used to conduct these studies. There is less chance of hurting participants in a study if there's no participants in the study. One of the disadvantages of the study is finding relevant, up-to-date, and accurate information within the form of public records or statistics. Sometimes there's no way to verify whether the data provided is accurate or not. When sociologists perform secondary data analyses, they'll want to know where the information they use came from, when the study was published, and why the information is pertinent to the study. Well, I hope this video helps you along with your sociology. If you like the video, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk with you soon.